Okay, just going to say that over. Welcome to the session Working with Donors. So I am going to turn it over to our first presenter.
Oh, and I think that's us. Okay, so let me share screen. Ours is pre-recorded, so we can just watch. Greetings, and thank you for inviting us to talk. Today, we'll be highlighting some of the results from the Virtual Footlocker Project in this presentation. Just as a broad overview, the Virtual Footlocker Project in its entirety focuses on the development of an open source cross-system platform for capturing and preserving personal communication and the documentary record of the modern soldier. This is a much larger project than just what we are talking about today, and I'm very happy to be joined by two of my project team members, our graduate assistant, Jillian Brownlee, and our postdoctoral researcher, Dr. Alan Martell. As I noted, this is a much larger project, but today we're going to focus in on the current phase of our project, phase 2. This phase is funded by an IMLS grant of about $400,000 that allowed us to pay for GA and a postdoctoral fellow, as well as for an advisory board, the inclusion of focus groups and conducting these focus groups, followed by an analysis of the findings and developing workshops and curriculum to support both archivists and veterans. And now to tell us a little bit more about the focus groups, I'm pleased to introduce Jillian.
Thank you. So we conducted 22 focus groups in total, 4 per military branch, divided between officers and enlisted. 2 of our groups were for women only, with one of each of those for officers and enlisted. These groups lasted from about an hour to an hour and a half, and each participant received $150 in compensation. Originally, these groups were supposed to take place in person, but when the pandemic hit, we switched to Zoom-based groups. This actually turned out to be a good thing in the end, as we got to bring in participants from all over the country. Once the groups concluded, we used open coding to analyze the transcripts. By the end of the focus groups, we had 99 participants. You can see the breakdown of the demographics here by rank, race, gender, and branch. When we first started recruiting, we attempted to have the same number of participants in each group, with the demographics reflecting the demographics of the branch they corresponded to. Of course, not everything works out exactly as we plan it, so these are the numbers that we wound up with. And now I'll hand off to Alan, who will discuss the Love Me binders.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. So now I would like to talk to you about one of the key findings that we detected since early on in our as we were holding our focus groups. We were very puzzled with this idea of the Love Me binders, which is essentially a way in which our military veterans start to record their personal archives, even from before they become veterans. That is, they begin from the moment that they are still active in service. And so before I explain what Love Me binders are, I would like to present to you what is the challenge that active service members and later veterans are faced with. So around the beginning of the Iraq War, digital media just exploded so much. And unfortunately, some of that stuff has already been lost. And a lot more will be lost because people just don't know how to preserve this stuff and then think about it. So again, anything that can get people to think about it closer to the point of generating these artifacts in media and stuff is great. And so what we can see here is essentially a recognition among the people that we talk to that there is a change that begins early in the 2000s with the advent of more pervasive digital technologies, especially the mobile phones, but not only that, and how that changes the way in which they were going about handling their own information. It posed certain challenges, right? And so one of the challenges that they face now is related to the loss of records. So another quote, the digital stuff I had primarily on thumb drives, and I had like these huge terabyte when they were like ginormous. Now you can get nice size ones that are small, but I lost that one in them. And that one hurt my heart. I was like, no, I've lost everything. Or movies we watched, the random billions of songs you downloaded just to keep your mind occupied that we used to play in our backgrounds. All of that got lost in the movie, and I was devastated. I think I dropped a few cellular tears for that. And so in this case, what we can see now is that on the one hand, military life is riddled with a lot of complications, including the fact that many service members are required to move from one place to another. And in that mayhem of having to switch places, often people not only lose stuff in the physical sense, sometimes basically their information can also get broken. They stop, their devices where they keep the records stop working. Or in other cases, they may lose access to the accounts where they were holding digital information. And this matters because then all those memories, all those experiences, and all those proofs of the training, of their medical information, all of that is at risk. And so when we talk about record loss, we're talking about several phenomena here, but some of the things that we notice most commonly, more repeatedly throughout the data is that some people are simply not documenting because they didn't consider it back when they were active service members. This is mostly among veterans, but then also a lot of people complain about how the agencies handling the move are not very trustworthy. And so they always told us that they made a point of keeping with them very close to themselves the things that were most important, because they knew that trusting them would imply the risk of losing information. Then occasionally some people would place stuff in the wrong places, and others would, as I said, just lose access because either the devices where they kept the digital stuff broke, or because they lost the passwords, or their accounts where they were handling stuff in the cloud, basically they got deleted due to inactivity. And so just to offer some context about the challenge posed by digital records in the early 2020s, plus the difficulties of keeping that information in the long term. One of them is prior research has told us already that there are underrepresentation in health records among health service providers and the government. Conditions such as PTSD may be underrepresented in the data. And then we also know that for veterans, they require proof of their time of service in order to access their benefits. And the information of the government can sometimes be inaccurate. And so to these three factors, we also noticed to our own data collection that active service members have been actively encouraged in the last 20 years, especially to keep, to manage their own records. And so this is where the Lovely Binders comes into the picture. The daily journal that I kept, especially when I was deployed, I used that to develop when I was going through the process of getting a certain percentage based on different things that were wrong with me from being deployed twice and the regular day-to-day in the Army. I was able to go back to exact dates and times when certain events happened, which aided in that process because of, on the flip side, the Army didn't keep very good records of what I did and didn't do and what went on. So that was a huge help to me when it came to getting my percentage for my disabilities that I have, including my PTSD. I think at a greater rate, just because I did have those records myself. I wasn't relying on the Army, the Army remember, or what I could remember from memory. So that was really instrumental for me. And so here we can see how the fact that people are now taking, that active service members are taking active steps to document their experiences early on in their service pays significantly in the long term and allows them to access healthcare, among other benefits. And so which kinds of information do we get here? So what is the format in which this information is being recorded? Well, we have 3-ring binders, we have filing cabinets, and of course, as we see in the picture, footlockers. These are not by any means, this is not by any means an exhaustive list, but it represents some of the most common formats in which people are recording their information. Likewise, some of the most common types of records that we saw are their discharge papers, their DD-214 forms, school certificates, awards, annual reviews, travel orders, PCS orders. What do people use this information for? So here's an example. For me, I like to keep just so when my son gets older, he can see it and be like, whoa, my mom's a badass. I mean, I'm gonna remind him as long as I live that I am a badass, but just so he can see all the stuff that we have. I mean, my husband's grandpa, he still has stuff from when he was in, and he actually went through it with him not too long. So it's just kind of nice to go back and look and see what you have been through and all the experiences you had while you served. In this example, we can see a lot of intentions at play as to why people keep the records. On the one hand, I mentioned earlier the idea of accessing benefits, but there is also the opportunity to reminisce, to remember with that fondness those times in service and the hardship that people overcame. But in this quote in particular, we see that there is also something else at stake, something symbolically far more valuable to people, which is their legacy. What is it that is going to be left for society or their families after they're gone? And so, moving forward, what we're planning to do is to work on developing a curriculum. We're thinking of working on curriculum both for archivists and for active duty service members and veterans. We also are going to make these curriculum publicly available. And we also want to focus more on external promotion of our project. And of course, we also want to do some outreach to the academic community through conferences and publications. And finally, to save our data for posterity through data banking.
If you're interested in keeping up with the project, and sorry, I'm going to start that over. If you're interested in keeping up with the project, then you can either check our website, virtualfootlocker.com, or you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Instagram being @virtualfootlocker and Twitter being @virtfootlocker.
Thank you again for allowing us to present part of our data today. We have a lot more rich and robust data. Of course, we can't get into everything in the time limitations of a presentation, but we look forward to engaging with you in the question and answer session. And if you have any questions about this project or how things are going, you can always also reach out to us directly via email, and we'd be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much again, and we look forward to the discussion and question and answer session.
All right, I'm next up. My name is Andrew Hinton. I'm head of collection development at the Sam Johnson Vietnam Archive at Texas Tech University. And I'm also the archivist for a project we have working here called the Archive of Modern American Warfare, which we're looking to collect and preserve records from veterans who served after the Vietnam War, particularly post 9/11 veterans. And so my presentation in a pre-recorded video is talking about a oral history project that I did almost 2 years ago now, back in the summer of 2019, where I went to Fort Hood to interview veterans to talk to them about their personal record keeping practices and preservation practices. So let me just share screen. During the summer of 2019, I conducted oral history interviews with U.S. Army soldiers at Fort Hood in order to answer the following 3 research questions. Number 1, what personal records do soldiers keep of their military experience, especially after they have been deployed? Number 2, what do soldiers do, if anything, to preserve their records of their military experience? And number 3, how do soldiers value their personal records of their military experience? I conducted oral history interviews during the summer of 2019 with U.S. Army soldiers at Fort Hood, one of the largest military installations in the world and home to many recent veterans and active duty service members. There were 31 individuals interviewed. 28 were male, 3 were female, 6 were black, 21 were white, and 4 were Hispanic. The subjects ranged from privates in their early 20s who had yet to deploy, to captains who had experienced 2 tours in Iraq and/or Afghanistan, to colonels nearing retirement who had experienced multiple deployments that included conflicts prior to 2001. The interviews ranged from 45 minutes to 4.5 hours per subject. Each interview consisted of a complete oral history of the soldier's life up to their current duty station and covered their background and service history, as well as the central research questions. Oral history was chosen as the research method in order to investigate the ways in which subjects' personal history, such as major life events or familial upbringing, affected their personal digital archiving practices. From the findings, subjects were categorized into 3 groups: no preservation, physical preservation only, and high preservation. No preservation individuals were those who either kept no records whatsoever of their military experience or were doing nothing to actively preserve the records that they did have. The majority of subjects, 58%, fell into this category. There were 3 main reasons for why a soldier would fall into the no preservation category. First, there was evidence of a general lack of digital preservation knowledge among soldiers. Digital materials were kept on storage media, including SIM cards, cell phones, external hard drives, thumb drives, and disks, and while many soldiers kept these storage media in cool, dark, and dry conditions, some even going so far as to lock them in a safe or in some way physically separate them from other like storage media so as not to mix them with other digital records or risk them being accidentally wiped. Nothing was being done to preserve the digital records. In fact, following their deposit in the safe or other storage location, there was no attention paid to the storage media whatsoever, except when the soldier wished to retrieve records or add to the collection. This was particularly troubling in light of the fact that many soldiers would type up physical records, such as letters or journals, with the goals of decreased physical storage space requirements and increased legibility, but also with the misguided understanding that the simple act of transferring to digital was all that was required to ensure the long-term preservation of the records. Social media was heavily used by soldiers as digital preservation tools, with Facebook used for photographs and YouTube used for moving image recordings. Despite the social media websites' inherent problems for digital preservation, from the well-known fact of the company's poor track record for data protection that scandals such as that involving Cambridge Analytica have brought to light, to less widely known concerns such as the fact that the company adds its own metadata to photographs uploaded to the website, which can interfere with the provenance of the original record and strip away important contextual information. A common refrain reported by soldiers when asked how they are preserving their digital photographs was, quote, "Facebook keeps them." This was done both on an individual as well as a group basis, with entire units often having a Facebook page with multiple photo albums from particular deployments or missions, and unit members uploading collections of photographs over time. The same is done with YouTube for moving image recordings. As a consequence of these readily accessible online archives of photographic and moving image records, many soldiers do not bother to make any records of their own experiences. Instead, their personal archive of their military experience consists primarily or wholly of other people's records. Photographs and videos that they have downloaded from the internet that come to represent a record of either specific experiences with a particular unit or of a particular place, or the general military culture in which they served. Subjects told stories that suggest the presence of a sharing culture among modern veterans. At relatively stable locations, often a transfer station such as one in Kuwait or Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, soldiers would take chance encounters with fellow soldiers from varying units as an opportunity to build their collection of what they considered to be the most captivating digital photographs and videos documenting the war. A reliance on social media for digital preservation shifts this sharing culture to the online space, thereby increasing its reach exponentially. The result of this is demonstrated by anecdotal evidence from my own work as archivist for the Archive of Modern American Warfare at Texas Tech University. During appraisal and accession actions, I consistently found whole collections of photographs and videos accumulated rather than created by donors, and often these materials were duplicates from the collections of other donors who did not share any overlapping service history. These digital records largely documented major events during the time of the donor's military service, such as the capture of Saddam Hussein. Quote, action scenes, such as videos of an airstrike resulting in casualties or photographs of the aftermath of a car bomb detonation, or commemorative videos for a particular unit, one with whom the donor may or may not have served. The presence of a sharing culture and the reliance on social media for digital preservation has implications for the robustness of the historical record for modern conflicts and the diversity of voices being preserved. General apathy was a second reason for why a soldier would fall into the no preservation category. Some soldiers would keep digital records, but then appear unconcerned over whether they could ever be retrieved again. A common answer to a question regarding where the soldier kept their digital records was, quote, "They're on my phone somewhere." Many soldiers would still have the original phone that they carried during their service and used to record their experiences, but then would talk about switching to a new phone model and not being overly concerned with ensuring that everything transferred to each new device. Indeed, some reported digital record losses because of this action. Physical record keeping was also a challenge for these individuals. Some spoke of having the idea of keeping a journal, but then would give up on it after a few entries after deciding it wasn't their style, or they just couldn't get into the habit of doing it. For others, the value they placed on their personal military records would change after major life events, such as the soldier who kept a detailed journal of his time in Iraq, only to later throw it away after a painful divorce because he didn't want the memories he now associated with that time in his life. Regardless of the reason for the feeling of apathy toward record keeping, it was almost always a temporary mindset. The vast majority of those soldiers who did not keep any records stated that it is one of their biggest regrets. The third reason why a soldier would fall into the no preservation category had to do with security concerns. For soldiers working in active war zones, many of which carried certain security clearances during their tenure, there were obvious implications that affected their ability to create records of their experiences. Subject number 7, a lieutenant, had recently returned from deployment to Syria as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. His records, including notes of his activities and digital photographs stored on his phone, were kept solely as an operational necessity, and not only were they very closely monitored, such as keeping very brief notes written in his own personal shorthand and disabling the cloud service on his phone so that photographs were not inadvertently backed up anywhere, but they were destroyed once they had served their immediate purpose. Behavior such as this is typical and understanding for high-level operations, and the need to strike a balance between minimizing records for operational security and keeping records for later historical study of those operations is a tricky line to walk. But there are also instances of soldiers being overly cautious and declining to keep records of their experiences, even in situations where doing so would not have been an obvious security concern. This was most prevalent among the lower enlisted privates and young officers who foresaw making a career out of the Army. These individuals mentioned feeling uncertain as to when it would and would not be appropriate to take records, especially photographs and videos, during their deployment, and opted to not take any records at all rather than risk security violations or censure from a superior. The second category that emerged from the research findings was the physical preservation only group, or PPO, shown in the graph here as some preservation. Those soldiers who fell into this category were those who exhibited good physical record keeping, but were failing to adequately preserve their personal digital records. A small minority of subjects, only 10%, fell into this category. Subject number 4, a captain, had kept shoeboxes of correspondence that she had had between her and her fellow soldier husband while deployed, but was also storing a fairly significant collection of digital records on flash drives in her office drawers with no attention being paid to their preservation. Subject number 31 kept a journal for every one of his deployments, but also kept his digital records on storage media in a desk drawer at home and was also taking no steps toward their preservation. While sharing many of the same reasons for their lack of proper preservation actions as the no preservation group, low general technology efficacy was particularly evident for the PPO group. Many soldiers stated that they were not really a technical person, or language to that effect. Subject number 4 said that she wanted to show her daughter that by choosing the physical communication format of letters and preserving these physical records of their military experiences, her and her husband, quote, were keeping it old school, even in 2009, the age of technology, end quote. This suggests a reluctance to engage too extensively in digital record keeping, and an admission that this position may be an antiquated one. It should be noted that subject number 4 was a 30-something woman, 20-something during the time of her deployment, and advanced age was not shown to be a correlating factor in displaying signs of low technology efficacy. I have noted in my own work that some soldiers may be passing on the propensity for avoiding digital record keeping to future generations as well. As I once overheard a 30-something veteran telling a group of ROTC students at a Veterans Day event to, quote, make sure to write physical letters home and maybe keep a journal. You're really going to appreciate having that physical record of your experience when you get back, end quote. The final and most intriguing category of subjects was the high preservation group. This category consisted of those soldiers who kept detailed records of their military experience in both physical and digital formats and exhibited excellent stewardship of these records. A significant minority of soldiers interviewed, 32%, fell into this category. Subject number 9 had a large photograph collection that included approximately 400 digital photographs that he had backed up, as well as a number of physical photograph albums where he kept countless photographs that he had taken with disposable film cameras. He also had a full set of correspondence between himself and his parents written while he was deployed. All of these physical records were stored in places such as a closet or under a bed, and the soldier noted that their cool temperature and absence of light made them ideal for the record's preservation. Subject number 10 talked about a medic who had been designated his unit's unofficial historian and who ran a digital photograph archive consisting of photographs from the platoon that was backed up. This same soldier talked about his own records, which included photographs, journals, notebooks, and sketches, all of which either physically stored in a cool, dark location or digitally backed up. This soldier discussed how he was encouraged to take an active role in keeping records of his military experience after his grandmother showed him his grandfather's personal records from the Vietnam War. Many other examples were found in this category of soldiers backing up digital materials using multiple storage media and cloud storage, having their parents or significant others keeping all the letters sent home, keeping storage bins full of physical photographs and personal papers, and keeping daily journals. By far the most committed soldier was subject number 19, who took his VHS-C tape recordings and converted them to digital files, storing the originals in a cool, dark location. He then backed up the digital files along with his collection of digital photographs using both a local RAID system and cloud storage. More research needs to be done to determine the characteristics of high preservation individuals. The most important determinant of the personal digital archiving behavior of modern soldiers is the value that a soldier ascribes to their personal digital records. Some soldiers see their military service simply as a steady job, albeit an incredibly honorable one. For example, subject number 11, a specialist who was a child of migrant farmers, spoke about his efforts to improve his economic situation growing up in Mexico by getting an American education and starting a career in the IT field. The Army was seen solely as a way to gain valuable work experience that could be used to transition into employment in the civilian world. The limited value this soldier placed on his military service was reflected in his lack of personal archiving behavior. His personal military records consisted of digital photographs from his first deployment, which he kept on his phone. Many of these photographs were lost when he transitioned to a new device, except for a handful that he posted to Facebook. At the time of the interview, this soldier was undecided as to whether he would leave the Army after a few years or make it a lifelong career. It is reasonable to posit that the latter could lead to an increased value being placed on his military service, which may lead to a corresponding increase in effective personal archiving behavior. A soldier's personal growth is correlated with greater value placed on their personal digital records and greater documentation over time. Many of the soldiers that were interviewed discussed keeping more records of their experiences on later tours, when they had become, quote, more mature and concerned about having something tangible to look back on from this time in their lives. Some of the soldiers had later had children, which caused an increased concern for wanting to preserve their legacy and leave something behind to help their children better understand their experiences. This concept of value was primarily temporally fixed on the life of the individual soldier, as most soldiers saw their personal records as merely useful tools for short-term activities, such as reminiscing, especially for memories involving fallen battle buddies, so that their faces were not forgotten, or connecting with their children. Two notable exceptions to this emerged from this study's findings. Subjects number 10 and subject number 19. These were soldiers whose concept of the value of their personal records transcended their own lives. In their view, these records were not merely useful for personal remembrance, but rather as a public good worthy of historical study. It's no surprise that these individuals are two of the high preservation subjects. Subject number 10 spoke about being inspired by the sheer breadth of his grandfather's personal Vietnam War records and the boon for military historians that his grandfather represented, as well as the feeling of responsibility to save as much as he could from his own military experiences to model his grandfather's efforts. For subject 19, the oral history interview was an opportunity to delve into the philosophical underpinnings of modern warfare and the ways in which the study of war is really a psychological study of mankind. He stated his belief that the personal records of modern soldiers can help future generations better understand these areas of study. At the time of their interview, both individuals were pursuing graduate degrees in history, and subject number 10 had taken on responsibilities as a member of 3 Corps' military history detachment. The correlating factors between an interest in history education and high-level personal archiving behavior is a fruitful area for future research. This study examined the personal archiving practices of a group of U.S. Army soldiers based out of Fort Hood. Further research should be done with larger sample sizes to compare the findings of this study with those of similar studies of soldiers from other branches, particularly the Marine Corps, which is known for the care and attention it gives to preserving its organizational history. While the findings of this study suggest that there are inherent problems in the record-keeping habits of modern soldiers, these problems can be mitigated. By encouraging greater personal archiving practices among today's soldiers, we can ensure that we have a robust historical record of modern conflicts for future historians. Thank you for listening.
Hi, everyone. Well, I'm next. I'm going to be doing mine live, the renegade that I am. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay. Okay, great. Well, my name is James Williamson. I am the digital preservation librarian at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. My brief presentation today is called Stakeholder Relations and Digital Archives in a University Setting. Originally, it was donor relations in digital archives in the university setting, but when you're that implies a certain type of donor, and internal stakeholders, they're different in kind of many nuanced ways. And yes, they are donors, but they're not donors. So I felt like stakeholders better reflected kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So just to give you a little bit background for digital archives and digital preservation at SMU, we started our digital preservation program 2017, 2018. Not exactly sure when. That was in the before time. So it's kind of hard to remember sometimes. But when we initially started the program, is very much focused on working on our documentation and our workflows, figuring out kind of the scope of the program and how we wanted to handle our born digital records. That involved installing tools on a workstation, so BitCurator, Duke Data Accessioner, Fixity, so a number of different tools to kind of complete the various digital preservation mini tasks. And then we worked with our IT to establish dedicated server storage for these files. The digital preservation librarian position itself actually works in the digital services department, which we call the Norwich Center for Digital Services, and collaborates with archivists in special collections and other special libraries on campus. So, I help collect, preserve, arrange, and sometimes describe in cooperation with archivists who maintain the donor relationships, or the internal stakeholder relationships. To kind of underpin all that, during this entire time we were setting up this program, we were actually looking at a digital preservation system to replace our workstation and server storage. We had a digital asset management system, and in 2016 had decided to replace it with another one, but then ended up convincing ourselves that we needed a little bit more than just digital asset management, and we focused on digital preservation. So during this entire time, we've been, well, not the entire time of the program, but starting in 2019, we began implementing Rosetta. And then in 2020, we've begun moving assets from our old digital asset management system to Rosetta. So we completely you kind of changed the earth beneath our ground as we were developing our program and beginning to reach out to internal stakeholders in the university to begin collecting the records. So, you know, it provided some clarity in some areas and kind of muddied the waters in others because we're just still working on things. So these are just some of the resources, you know, that, you know, just went into the process. So our digital preservation framework, which you can look at, and our materials relating to donating born digital or electronic records to the archives. I'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of some of the challenges that we face with that. And then obviously, you know, no policy or material is created in a vacuum. So I just share some of the material that I used. The Clear Report for Born Digital Guidance for Donors, Dealers, and Archival Repository. It's a great resource. The Born Digital Workflow from the University of Montana. This is sort of outdated, but this draft version is a pretty succinct way and really helped us kind of, you know, wrap our heads around kind of step by step what we were going to do. So, but I've got a lot more. If you want my archive of preservation policies, they're cited in the documents, and then you can just ask me and I'll send you a trove of policies. Okay, so kind of the challenges with born digital records in a university setting. Obviously, you know, this holds true for physical records, but convincing your stakeholders that born digital content is archival. That's a pretty similar discussion that we have on kind of a lot of different fronts, but kind of it takes on a different connotation within a university. And often you're trying to educate your community the same time that you're beginning the discussions about transferring into the repository. And usually, you know, you have established relationships and they've donated physical material in the past. This, you know, then this will be often the first time they've donated digital material. So you're kind of walking a fine line between education and then also kind of moving them forward to give you what you need. You know, and then you have to convince these stakeholders that all these digital preservation measures are worth the time and effort. Obviously, I think a lot of people take a great comfort of keeping your digital files close to you, like on an accessible server. You go into everybody's got a V drive or something kind of drive that everybody in the department knows about, and you can access anything that you need theoretically. Whether people in a department actually do that is a different matter, but there's a certain amount of comfort that it's close by, and that, okay, we're giving it to the libraries and they're going to preserve it, and then they're going to make it available. And, you know, obviously sometimes space drives these decisions, so they're going to have to at some point remove their local copy, and there's a certain amount of discomfort that goes along with it. And if you're developing your digital preservation program, you know, sometimes you have answers to certain aspects, like preserving the files, but you may not have all the answers for access. And then it, you know, you're convincing your stakeholders you're to be trusted with the material. You know, in our case at SMU, we have a great university archivist who is beloved by people on campus, but, you know, here's this person coming from you know, an internal department within the library that that people may not know actually existed, and here's this person kind of trying to reassure you, oh, we can preserve your records, and you haven't built up the trust that the special collections department has. And then there's challenges with access. And this is kind of how Rosetta kind of comes into the discussion. You know, as we were trying to figure out things, we didn't really have an answer to how we would provide access. We knew how we were going to preserve both, you know, through a microservices system or through, you know, an actual preservation system like Rosetta, but we didn't really have a clue on, or not have a clue. We didn't have a clear picture on providing access. So you're going into these discussions kind of giving like vague promises of how you might be able to provide access, and you know, you have the confidence to know that you're going to be able to work through it, but they may not. And then, you know, when you're dealing with university material, there's a good chance that it's already available on the university's website, that, you know, these statistics, these press releases, communications, whatever, are on the website. They may be buried somewhere, but they're there. And so, you know, someone can say to you, well, why do we need to preserve and make it accessible, especially if you haven't figured out your clear picture for access. But that could also be an advantage as well, because if you are able to convince these records to be transferred, then you have a window for trying to figure out the access because it's on the university website. But you know, you also have to make sure that the university doesn't change website management systems and go through this giant purge of web pages and things that are in the media library and things like that. So you can build yourself a window to kind of figure that out, but also, you know, it's not forever. There's a time limit. There are obviously going to be discussions on privacy and restrictions. And so I'll talk a little bit about project selection and how that comes into play. But, you know, at times we can be very flippant with our digital records as people. And certainly a department can be as well, especially with people coming in and out. But you can also be very protective of digital records as well. So you're kind of, once again, walking that fine line. And then with our implementation of Rosetta, we do finally have a clear picture of how we're going to provide access to the born digital records that we put in our preservation repository, and how we're going to be able to kind of sync it up with our catalog, because they're both ex libris products. And so now we can start providing access to these born digital records in our repository through the catalog. But at the time of these discussions were first happening, that wasn't very clear. So that is a challenge that we faced, and a lot of people will face. I feel like as we've all become more and more educated on how to handle born digital records, access tends to be the hardest nut to crack sometimes. So let me talk to you about some how we kind of went about with project selection and how that kind of influenced the internal stakeholders that we began talking to. And so this is obviously going to be set in the university archives world. So I worked with our archivist, Joan Gosnell, to kind of create a list of must-have records or endangered records, endangered in quotation marks, because sometimes they were not endangered and sometimes maybe they were. But we focused on the press releases that come out of SMU. Obviously, presidential and provost papers is a big deal. External affairs, the photographs that document all the events that happen on campus. Then the historical legal records of the university, contracts and things of that nature. And what we looked at is, one, what collections already existed in a physical form, you know, and kind of thought, okay, that would be a benefit to us because they have, you know, we don't have to create a new accession record. It's an accrual, and we've kind of got this descriptive structure. We just have to update the finding aid, you know, let's take it simple and slow and things like that, rather than, okay, let's bring in this whole new record, this whole new accession we had to create all the records, we had to create the catalog records, we had to do the XML file that's going to go into Taro, and things like that. And then we also looked at, picking a department that you had good relations with, which is pretty easy with Joan because everybody loves her. But also, like, the material has few issues. Ownership is very clear. In the case of the presidential papers, President Turner has been here a while, both he kind of straddles the digital era. And he looks like he's going to continue to be here for a while. So that would be a collection that have a little bit more hurdles. External affairs, even though the university owns materials, you got a lot of different photographers, and there could be things that for your first project you may not want to kind of muddy the waters. And then legal records, the legal department's so protective of those that maybe for your first project it might not be worth the time, because we were figuring out the processes and we couldn't make certain guarantees to them at that point. But yeah, so we looked at people who might be more grateful to have us take the stuff off their hands, aka their hard drives, and then just less red tape and discussion concerning copyright. But we ended up selecting a project that did have a physical form already in the SMU press releases, and that, I think, as we'll discuss in a little bit, kind of turned into somewhat of a con, because we kind of fully didn't realize the scope of the digital records versus the physical records and how they would jive together. And I'll talk a little bit more. So when we started, kind of building the relationship for the SMU press release project, with the head of that department and the executive assistant, we asked for select years to fill in the gaps that were missing from the physical records, because we had the published press releases. But then they ended up asking, well, the published press releases aren't the only thing. Do you want the draft versions? Do you want what they call pending releases? Or do you want, releases that got pulled for whatever reason? And kind of, we said we take all those releases, and that would come back to be a bigger thing. But in reality, maybe after the first meeting, it was mostly just correspondence with an executive assistant to kind of make things easy for us. They just gave us everything from the beginning. So it wasn't, the gaps that we had started in 2008 or so, when they just moved to fully online, and then they gave us everything dating back to 1994. So we received published versions, pending releases, pulled releases, like we asked, that we agreed to, but it was way more than what we bargained for. And then the weirdest thing, the older files came to us as executable files for some reason. And so we had to go in and pull the original file formats and convert it back to the original files, because obviously these were just press releases, they weren't actual programs. So we had to turn them back into TXT files or RTF files. And then you ended up with, if you include the web version of all these publications, all these press releases, which included photographs and formatting and kind of display things, you ended up with 4 or 5 copies of the same press release, all in slightly different forms, that you could sort of convince yourself, well, maybe we do need those. And so it became a bigger discussion of the material itself. The good thing is, as when we were talking to them about obviously their naming structure and things like that, because we wanted to know that information before moving the material to repository, that stayed pretty similar for 20 plus years. So thumbs up to the press release department at SMU for consistency in that regard. So kind of the lessons learned from kind of the discussions that we were having with internal stakeholders, especially as it relates to this press release project. I needed to be more willing to insert myself in the transferring process. I think it was easier to just say, give us everything, because it's an internal donor or an internal stakeholder. Whereas an external donor, you've kind of already built up the confidence to maybe say, I don't need this, this, and this. I want this, I don't need this. But the transfer process, because it's digital files, it's so easy in a way. In this case, we had everything moved to a hard drive, and then we took the hard drive to our workstation and processed on the workstation. So real easy, and kind of as your first project to kind of build confidence. But had I been part of the transfer process more and been more willing to kind of put myself in the middle of that, and it would have been less extra work for the digital archives team. And then, appraisals is easier than the post facto cleanup that we had. We kind of our kind of decision making was, okay, we'll start with kind of these pilot projects and develop from there an electronic records development policy. But really, had we just kind of created an electronic records development policy, even if it was in draft form, even if it wasn't fully completed, it would have helped us in the conversations that we had with these internal stakeholders, and maybe limited all the extra stuff that kind of came our way. And I think, and I pointed to another big point was, I think our documentation was aimed outward, as I pointed to both the donor material that we have created and coming from, the various sources. It was all kind of derived from kind of your external archivist, potential donor coming into the library wants to donate their collection perspective. And while those questions do work well, I think the documentation that we needed and the questions that we needed to ask our internal donors needed to vary a little bit and needed to be different, and we needed to have sort of different expectations and where we would be involved and where we wouldn't be. And so I think the lesson would be, okay, the material that you create needs to have very different audiences, and you can't say, well, I've created my policy for this, it will serve all aspects of born digital records and digital archives, and that just is not the case. It's not going to be completely different, but it will vary, and it needs to be, you at least know your audience, the university setting, and you kind of have a sense of things somewhat operate, rather than an external donor who's maybe coming in that you don't have a relationship with. So you should use that to your advantage when you're drafting your policies and your kind of communication that you're going to have with these internal stakeholders. And then obviously the big thing, it added a lot of unnecessary content, which was not conducive to our new digital preservation repository. I expect as we kind of grow in confidence, we'll be more comfortable with deaccessioning and things like that. And our system allows us to do more of that with greater confidence in our decision making. But we're kind of not there yet. I think, I bet 5 years down the road, presentations at SSA will be about deaccessioning born digital content. Right now, it's just kind of taking everything in, figuring out how that kind of jives with you and your organization. And eventually we'll get to the part where we can actually start talking about deaccessioning and how that wasn't a huge part of those initial discussions with our stakeholders. So we ended up with a lot of extra material, and the physical material was organized vastly different than what the digital archive that we received. And so that means we either have to change one to kind of fit the other, or just be okay with them being separate. But if we kind of want the way it was organized, the physical papers were organized in a way that really made sense. And so we kind of changed things around with the digital archive to make it more sense, but it kind of expanded the project even more. And it's the inventory is going to be quite the inventory. It's pretty impressive. So so those are just some kind of the lessons that I've learned in kind of the in discussing digital archives with internal stakeholders. So if you have any questions, obviously we'll do questions and answers here in the session, but if you come up with anything afterwards, please feel free to email me or call me if you want to talk about any aspect of this project. If you want to talk about policies or even Rosetta as a digital preservation system, feel free to contact me.
Okay, that wraps up the presentations. If anyone has any questions, they can leave them in the chat box. They can just unmute and ask. Or if anybody wants to talk about Moss on the IT crowd, you can do that too. All right.
Well, I guess I have a question. Oh.
No, go ahead, James.
Well, I kind of have a question for Andrew and Ed, since you both kind of covered, soldiers keeping military archives. Did the level of kind of personal archiving did you see a correlation between whether they were more willing to participate in projects such as the Virtual Footlocker, or was there kind of, if you felt like you weren't collecting enough or you did some kind of preservation, was there kind of a correlation, hesitancy to submit something or to participate in an oral history or something like that?
Well, I think for us, we actually had a pretty broad range of participants, from those who never kept anything to those who kept everything. And I think that's what really helped with our data, is having those extremes. One thing, as we kind of, I've done this in other presentations, but here's my Love Me binder. And it's just sitting right next to me because I happen to pull it out in the presentation. But it is interesting that a lot of our participants who didn't do anything while they were serving have shown some regret for that decision. And they just really wish they would have gone back in time and smacked themselves a little bit and said, hey, take some pictures, grab some postcards, do something. But Andrew, how about you?
From the oral history side of it, sort of thing, I think it would be almost the opposite in terms of those that didn't keep. Well, I definitely saw the same thing as you did in terms of the regret. Every single one of the people that I talked to that didn't keep anything deeply regretted it. They were definitely, that was a big thing. And so the oral history was an opportunity to be like, well, at least I have this, I'll tell my story and talk about my experiences in that way. And so I think talking in terms of correlation between those that kept and those that didn't keep, and willingness to do an oral history, it was those that had nothing that were definitely gung-ho to those were the longer ones. Like I say, they ranged from 45 minutes to 4.5 hours. Definitely the longer ones were definitely the ones that didn't keep anything and wanted to just talk and talk and talk, which was great. And so we have that in the archive, which is something.
Well, do you want me to read that, or do you all want to just respond to it? Actually, let me just read it. In the chat, it says, have any of your projects considered speaking to or interviewing ROTC students, perhaps as a way of conveying the value of preservation and how to or what to consider keeping?
I think in our, as we move forward with the curriculum development and planning out these ways of early intervention, that's definitely something that would be kind of low hanging fruit, because they're very easy to get material in front of on university campuses. Now, of course, high school ROTC is a little bit different because you're dealing with minors, but I definitely think that would be good. A good approach.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That definitely seems to be, like I mentioned in my presentation, some of the veterans are seeing that too as well, like reaching out to the ROT students and telling them, hey, you gotta think about this. And so there's definitely potential there in terms of working some protocols that not only us as archivists can go out and encourage this, but we can have veterans doing it themselves as well, encouraging it within their own community and within the ROTC community to be something to be mindful of before they go and enter the service.
And I mean, we've also discussed trying to get it more integrated, as particularly from the enlisted side, as one of those mandatory monthly enlisted lectures. You know, just along with the don't drink and drive, do document and preserve. But they're constantly being offered. Was there any correlation between collection habits and whether the individual was officer or enlisted? I initially collected because we were warned of the propensity to lose records. Now I'm certainly grateful to have them. Alan or Jillian, do you want to talk about that?
I don't think I have. I have not been able yet to discriminate in the data whether there is a correlation between the ranking or the type of enlistment versus the documentation practices. My first impression is that perhaps like middle ranking officers may be more likely to be interested in documenting, mostly because they probably have more opportunity. They probably have a larger sense of responsibility over the people under their charge. But that's more a hypothesis. I will need to test it yet against the data.
And I think the higher ranking officers are also ones who are gifted things more often when they leave places. And I do recall from some of the focus groups with the officers, they tended to be the ones who had the plaques and the swords and all that stuff. Whereas like an E3, E4, one enlistment term and out person might get a going away party at a bar. They're not getting plaques. But yeah, the high propensity of losing records during moves, yeah, that comes up. Oh, James, looks like there's a question for you.
No, I wouldn't say no one has turned down kind of request. I think what has kind of happened is they'll delay it. So in the case of the legal records, I think they wanted to kind of do an internal review of said records that before they could release them to be in the archives. And obviously, you know, for legitimate reasons, but also, you know, those records were kind of just stored elsewhere, and it was going to be the project of a retired staff member to do so, and you know, obviously, you know, that takes time and things like that. So it's kind of more like delaying tactics. I don't think no one wants to change it, but they also they kind of want to feel they have a comfortable grasp on what they have before they release it. And I think that's just kind of an internal department, and depending on the types of materials. So external affairs is pretty competent because they have their files stored elsewhere and have a relationship with the university archivists to transfer it, and they're willing to do that kind of on a yearly or maybe every 2 years or so. So I think they have just a firm grasp on what they have, so they're more willing to. But if you kind of don't really know what you have, then I think your options are either just give it all, and let us work through it, let the person work through it, or kind of work on it yourself and kind of delay things out, I guess, in a way. I'm pretty sure there are. You would have to ask Joan that question.
Are there plans?
Yeah,
sorry, James, real quick.
You can go ahead and read the question.
Yeah, I watched the Tarot Brown Bag, and I realized that they don't save the chats when they put them on demand. So this is like in the audience when you have to take the microphone around, even though people don't like it when you do that. Anyway, are plans to work with other archivists on campus regarding collecting external digital archives, or providing some training to these staff members so that they can speak to digital preservation while working with external donors?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have collected some external digital archives, but I think for us, or at least for me, I've been in this process of implementing Rosetta and the migration of all our 40-something terabytes from one system to the other, and it's not a one-to-one relationship, especially if you were there for Danielle's session on moving from Constantium to Preservica. So it's kind of helping contribute to the archivist in our special collections department and bringing in collections. And so when they have brought it in, it's kind of been either they're seeking something else within the collection that comes with digital stuff, or they've brought it in themselves, and we've kind of had to work on it, but kind of at a slower pace because of the migration. But yeah, I think it kind of, when I was discussing, working with the university archivist, I think since it's kind of a three-way dance, that really also needed to be, providing the same sort of training and communication to the archivist that you're working with, so that everybody's kind of on the same page, rather than just assume some knowledge that they have or something like that. So yeah, so internal trainings and internal communications about digital archives is just as important as when you're communicating with an external stakeholder internally in your university.
All right, we have 15 minutes left for Q&A if anybody has anything else.
Well, I kept thinking that when Andrew spoke, I sort of missed the part where you were explaining your a little bit of the method of your project. So I was wondering if you could speak just a little bit about why oral histories, and then how many people did you interview?
So I did oral histories with 32 individuals, and because it was oral history, I mean, it ranged from 45 minutes to 4.5 hours per person, depending on how willing they were to share and talk and whatnot. So I chose that as the method because I wanted to get a sense of whether familial upbringing and whether their background would inform their personal history, would inform the way that they thought of record keeping and record preservation and whatnot. And so I approached it from that way. And So I did. So it's a sample size, of course, is limited because of that respect, but can get a more in-depth view on each person. And so that was kind of what the method I took for that.
Thanks.
Ed, how long does the grant project run? You spoke on phase 2. How many intended phases are there?
75. No. Yeah, the idea of phases, yeah, it's gotten a little goofy. There's another year and a half. We're about halfway through the grant project right now. And the deliverables for the grant project have shifted a little bit, where I think we're going to focus more on the curriculum development, and make whatever the next step is of this project more focused on that implementation, and kind of push a little further down the road any software actual development. I think pointing veterans towards available software right now, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, would be better. But yeah, so originally there were 3 phases because 3 is a good number. But you know, it's a grant project. It evolves. And we're hoping to get more grant money or foundation money or some really rich person to write a check. That would be nice too. Heck, I'll rename the project if they want.
We don't complain if anybody wants to donate today.
Yeah. The nice thing with private donations, we don't have to do indirect cost sharing on them. So, haha.
Well, for those who are remaining, I think we should give a virtual round of applause to the presenters. And we appreciate you, again, taking your time to spread your wisdom and experience about your projects. I'm going to just mention that the last break with vendors is happening at 3 o'clock in about 10 minutes, and they'll be followed by the 2 last sessions. One is about, once again, staffing and working through the pandemic. One is about providing access remotely, and the other one is about finding aid cleanup during lockdown, which, you know, everybody is always trying to get to finding aid cleanup, and I feel like this is probably a really good opportunity to do that. If those don't entice you, there's tenure track careers in academic archives and libraries at 3:30, featuring a panel of 6. I will be moderating that one as well. And with that, there are still no questions. So Ed, if that's okay, we'll wrap early. Yeah. All right, thanks. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next year in Houston. Bye.